Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. This is the France 24 debate. We're looking at the sudden jihadist contagion that we've noticed in Iraq and also in neighboring Syria with a group that calls itself the Islamic State of Iraq. Some calling it Greater Syria, others the Levant. ISIS is its acronym. We're talking about it with Hadid Al-Sayegh, senior writer for daily newspaper The National, based in the Gulf. Thank you for being with us. From Amman, Jordan, Kirk Sowell, who is the publisher of Inside Iraqi Politics in Washington, D.C., the Rand Corporation's Alex Crowther, and here in the studio, Miriam Benrad of the European Center for Foreign Relations, and former U.S. diplomat William Jordan. Just before the break, we were describing Miriam, we were describing how it's this sort of three-way battle. You're saying it's not really a three-way battle. That's what we're witnessing in Fallujah.
Three-way battle
between the government forces, local militias, and the jihadists.
No, I think there is a very, very clear implication of all these groups. As I said, the tribes, the Sunni tribes, are themselves very divided, with some who felt betrayed by the Americans after the surge, who were transferred to the government. They were no longer on payroll. They didn't receive the privileges that they used to enjoy with the Americans. So some of them felt betrayed and indeed got closer to Al-Qaeda and now are fighting back with Al-Qaeda and other Salafist groups in the Al-Anbar province and in other regions of Iraq. Then you have the security forces and the new army who are working together with some other tribes who, as I said, now consider al-Maliki and his policy as the most, the less dangerous choice they can make to preserve their interests in their regions. Because it's important to recall that these tribes also were in open conflict with Al-Qaeda at some point around the control of the oil smuggling and a certain number of economic activities during the occupation. Then you have the people, the populations, who have been trying to to organize a number of peaceful demonstrations to claim their political reintegration and to have their say in the Iraqi transition. And these demands have been met by force by the government. Maliki has chosen to privilege the use of force, to send the military to these provinces. And this whole picture has radicalized the Sunnis towards, as I said, more sympathy and support to groups like Al-Qaeda.
All right, let's pick up on that first point that you made. Alex Crowther, one of the cornerstones of the success of the so-called surge was that Washington helped to pay off, basically, militias to switch sides. Now that Washington is gone, Miriam Benrad making the argument that they're disgruntled. Was this all too predictable?
Yes, in 2009, we had this problem in Iraq. I was working in Baghdad at the time, and the United States had the militias on the payroll, and we transitioned responsibility over to the government of Iraq, and they stopped paying them. We tried to get them to continue to pay them, and so it was an on-again, off-again thing. But once we left the country in 2011, al-Maliki just wanted nothing to do with them.
All right, and today, Fallujah, the theater of the bloodiest fighting U.S. troops have seen since the Vietnam War. This was back in 2004 that this happened. 1,800 GIs killed at the time. Certainly no one in Washington planning a return of U.S. forces with that in their minds.
Now, we're going to do everything that is possible to help them. And I will not go into the details except to say that we're in contact with tribal leaders from Anbar province, whom we know, who are showing great courage and standing up against this as they reject terrorist groups from their cities. And this is a fight that belongs to the Iraqis. That is exactly what the president and the world decided some time ago when we left Iraq.
Alex Crowther, what does John Kerry mean when he says we're in contact with tribal leaders in Anbar province?
In the United States Embassy in Iraq, there are people in the political section who are in touch with people from all the different parties throughout Iraq.
And how is he, when he's saying that that he's going to help, how is the United States helping?
Well, within Iraq, I would guess that the embassy is trying to discuss this with everybody and try to get everybody to calm down and not use violence. And then you've seen in the open press here discussions about security assistance selling weapons and ammunition to the government of Iraq.
Kirk Soule, do you read this the same way?
In terms of U.S. aid to Iraq, it's certainly true that they need help from a technological standpoint in terms of intelligence, reconnaissance. They are just very recently getting some reconnaissance technology. This has been a major weakness. So attack helicopters that they're just now getting out in the desert. This is something they absolutely need. At the same time, it's important to stress that the biggest problems the Iraqi security services have, and the biggest problem they need to fill, are internal reform issues. So, for example, when they have operations and 300 people are arrested, there's no transparency. There's no sense of how many of these people are innocent, how many are guilty. Often people are arrested and they have to pay a bribe in order to get out. So there's a lot of corruption in the military. Also, it's not very good at what we would call population-centric activities or counterinsurgency. It's just the last few days is actually a very good example of this. They've been shelling Fallujah, the city as a whole, and they've been saying, well, it's controlled by Al Qaeda. We're bombing terrorists. In fact, they're mostly killing civilians. The vast majority of people that kill are civilians. And for the past several days, especially Friday and Saturday, the Iraqi army was shelling Fallujah. So it's a blunt instrument. It's not a scalpel. So yes, Iraq does need military assistance and technological assistance. But more than anything, it needs internal reform.
Hadil Al-Sayeg, how much help would you like to see, as an Iraqi, how much help would you like to see the Americans give?
I think the issue is yes, Iraq does need weapons, but at the same time, the problem is that the Americans withdrew way too early. And the thing is, you can create democratic institutions, but you cannot create a democratic culture. And this is the problem. You have an absence of checks and balances, and there is nobody really to be able to, you don't have a system in place in which you have a viable legal judiciary system or a due cause system where you can actually govern an entire state. So we've seen a series of abuses just over the last 2 years. Ministers who have been purged from power based on corruption charges. But there hasn't been any kind of transparency in terms of due course. You see numbers of officials who have just fled the country, gone to the UK. The amount of corruption is staggering, and this is a culture that goes back to, unfortunately, the U.S. administration and the way that they handled, cash money with Iraqis, and this is something that is not going to just kind of go away.
So what should Washington do at this point?
I think there needs to be a stronger engaging policy with Maliki and the rest of the people who are running the country. There needs to be some sort of looking at how you can create a viable democratic state that looks at the national interest of the country. Unfortunately, there's a lot of Arab nepotism. There's a lot of personality politics, and that is going in the way of getting projects on the road, getting infrastructure. The majority of the current Iraqi budget is being spent on public service salaries. That means that there's no projects, there's no job creation. You have to keep in mind that there's a number. Iraq has a vast population, and the majority of that population is very young. So if you don't give them hope, you don't give them employment, you are going to constantly keep losing members of your population into militias, into terrorist groups and whatnot, because they need another source of income, unfortunately.
So William Jordan, 2 years after the Americans have left. How much of this would you say, listening to what Hadil al-Sayegh just said, is still Washington's problem?
I actually think very little of it is Washington's problem in the sense that...
or certainly its responsibility.
Responsibility, yes. I mean, and it's Washington's problem in the sense that Washington created the situation in Iraq. You could argue existentially that eventually Saddam Hussein would die, the previous regime would collapse somehow, and there would have to have been some sort of a transition, and Iraq might have ended up where it was after the U.S. invasion in any case. There's no question about it that the U.S. catalyzed and precipitated all of that. And so where we are is largely of the U.S. making. But in terms of the dynamic of the past, say, 5 or 6 years, in terms of the transition from for the U.S. withdrawal, the terms that the U.S. negotiated with the al-Maliki government, where there was essentially not to be any kind of a status of forces agreement that would allow for U.S. forces to remain in the country in any even limited capacity, and a consequent rethinking and resource-driven scaling back of American plans and ambitions in Iraq. I mean, the United States is now not really in a position to do anything more, in large measure, because of the political limitations that have been placed by al-Maliki and the Iraqi government. And I would, get to the point. I think that the previous speaker made the right point that there needs to be a real and more intense level of engagement between the Iraqi and the American leadership on the necessity for Iraq to make the long-promised political transitions that Maliki has largely, in pursuit of what I mentioned before, narrow political aims, rejected or refused to follow. However, we just had the situation where al-Maliki was in Washington, and I'm not convinced that when American leaders at that level, when President Obama sits down with Prime Minister al-Maliki, that they're having that kind of a direct discussion. And if they did, I'm not even sure that Prime Minister al-Maliki would pay attention, because he feels that he is beholden to the Iraqi people, and he is going to follow a political logic that he believes makes sense. Now the United States finds itself in a situation where it's looking at everything that it worked in Iraq to try to change, falling apart again and returning to levels not seen since 2007, 2008, and is really in no more of a position, and certainly has no political will, to re-engage in the way that one might think it should, given the responsibility the United States has.
Okay, right now, though, there's a fire to put out, as we see with what's going on. There's an urgency, a crisis. Alex Crowther, the Americans offering help and the Iranians also offering help this Monday. Do they have common interests, you might say? How do you feel about that?
Certainly the Iranians have an interest in empowering the Shia in Iraq, which is who Maliki represents. The big problem is that this is not a security issue. It's a political issue with security ramifications. The United States has been engaging Maliki nonstop since 2006 to treat the Sunnis with respect, to bring in the Sunnis and to share political power with the Sunnis, and he has ignored that request, advice, demand every time.
Hadil al-Sayegh, is it that simple?
No, I don't think it's going to be easy, but I think there are certain ways that you can pressure a government to follow your track. I think the fact that Iran has asked for its involvement in the situation will actually only worsen things right now, because tensions are really high among the Iraq Sunnis and Iraq Shias. The last thing we need is really any kind of regional intervention. I think the U.S. had a previous, during the surge, the U.S. had a very, very strong role as a broker. and try to speak on behalf of Iraq Sunnis with the Shias and put them at level play, despite the Ba'athist purge. So the involvement of the Iranians will just make things much worse.
Interestingly, on that point, there is a radical cleric, Muqtada al-Sadr, who's been in the past described as the protege of Iran. He's come out in the past couple of weeks making very moderate statements, calling on the Iraqi army not to be sectarian. He's, at least in rhetoric, seems more moderate in a ways than the prime minister.
Muqtada Sadr is playing a competition game with Maliki. So the two are at rivals with each other. And he has used every opportunity in his power to undermine Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. However, Sadr is behind the sectarian crisis that happened. So when the bombing happened in the Imam Askari shrine in 2006, 2007, it was the Sadrists that ended up bombing all the Sunni mosques, Sunni houses, and they ignited the sectarian war of Iraq. So I would take anything that he says with a pinch of salt. He's also trying to prepare himself. His political party is gaining popularity. We saw this from the provincial elections last year, and he's preparing for the legislative elections this year. So, and I think the Sunnis would know better than to take what he says quite seriously, given the past.
Do you agree, Kirksol, that Muqtada al-Sadr is in fact not to be believed when he's making these more moderate pronouncements?
Muqtada has definitely made a rhetorical transformation, and to a limited degree, a substantive transformation. I think he's tried to, bring his militia, make it more disciplined and keep them from engaging in sectarian fighting. That said, I totally agree. Just to add to what Adil said, Muqtada has blocked reform of de-Baathification. The Sadrists are really actually a big part of the problem, despite some of their sort of unifying rhetoric. They have blocked some of the reforms that actually need to go forward in terms of allowing more, former Baathists, mostly Sunnis, into the government.
So there's the situation with the pressure coming from Tehran, and then there's the pressure, and I got to put this to you as well, Kirksol. Who is behind ISIS? Who's behind these jihadists? Who bankrolls them? Who finances them?
Okay, so they essentially have two sources. One is at the lower level, the Iraqi government itself, because what ISIS is doing in the Sunni provinces is they assassinate government officials. Against Shia, they engage in mass casualty attacks. But against Sunnis, it's an assassination campaign. So they're not killing people in mass. What they do is they engage in extortion, and they get a lot of money that way. They also get a certain amount of money. I have no idea how much, but a certain amount of money from the Gulf, as other Salafist jihadist groups do get. But ultimately, ISIS is a completely independent organization, and this is important to emphasize. Even though colloquially we refer to them as Al-Qaeda, it would be most correct to not refer to them that way. They don't use the term, as you mentioned earlier. They are completely independent of Al-Qaeda leader Ayman al-Zawahiri. They have, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the ISIS leader, has actually rejected his direction. So this is a very independent organization. This is, in fact, the reason we're having so many problems in Syria right now, is because they're upsetting a lot of their ideological soulmates with the way they behave. So they're totally independent.
William Jordan, when you look at Syria right now, do you agree that, the Gulf states, the benefactors that are there, to what degree we don't know, as was just said, but those benefactors to radical Sunnis, they basically have no control over the ones that are on the ground?
I've said many times that I think the situation in Syria in particular is evolving into something like we saw with Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation. And you had a lot of money pouring in from the U.S. as well as the Gulf states, particularly Saudi Arabia, in support of the Mujahideen. And there was very little control once the money, the weapons, and the other materiel got in there as to who was actually receiving it and who was actually benefiting from it. And there were numerous internal factional conflicts among the sort of ranks of this supposedly united resistance movement. And I think everything that is happening in Syria.
But in that case, has ISIS taken on a life of its own, or could those Gulf states close the faucet?
No, I don't think they can close the faucet, but I also think that it's too much of a journalistic simplicity, sorry to say, to place too much of an emphasis on this idea of a jihadist contagion or Al-Qaeda run rampant. I mean, as has been said several times in the course of this debate, these groups don't. These groups affiliate with Al-Qaeda to a certain extent, but they don't make their Al-Qaeda affiliation the central aim or the central tenet of their sort of Salafist identity. I mean, they are operating on the terrain, they are operating in a local context, and I think, I see quite a difference between what's happening in Iraq as far as the Salafi struggle there and what's happening in Syria. There may be a common project ideologically behind them.
In both countries, you're seeing a three-way fight.
But it's even more than that in Syria. I mean, you're seeing factions momentarily ally in a local conflict while the regime sits back and watches, I think, with some delight, as these people tear themselves apart. But you're having these momentary constellations of forces come together to attack this or that group at any given time. I see the situation in Iraq differently. I'm not as much of an expert as Dr. Benrad and some of the others are on what's going on in Iraq, but I do think, getting back to my main point, is that I think we are probably overemphasizing the Al-Qaeda aspect of this, and losing sight of the fact that, at least as far as Syria is concerned, you probably could cut off the spigot of money and a lot of the weapons and still have a very bloody, sustained conflict going on. There are enough weapons, enough access to weapons, and enough going on that people will be able to sustain this conflict for a good long time to come.
So, Alex Crowther, what do you do in that case? How do you stop it?
I'm afraid that the only long-term solution is to either get Maliki to embrace the Kurds and the Sunnis, or to replace Maliki through the Iraqi electoral system with someone who will treat the Kurds and the Sunnis with respect.
Miriam Benrad?
I think just to complete what was said on both Syrian and Iraqi cases, we're clearly witnessing now the rise of Salafism as the most attractive ideology and somehow anti-system doctrine today among youth in both Syria and Iraq. In both cases, the fighters that have been fighting the US army in Iraq and the Sunni fighters that we are seeing today in Syria have been socialized in Salafism, which somehow developed against the authoritarian nation states in both countries. And in both cases, they're rejecting these nation states, again, that they equate with the past authoritarian orders. And in the case of Iraq, it was exacerbated by the sanctions. Nobody's speaking about the embargo, but all these combatants have been socialized in Salafist mosques under the embargo during the sanctions, and the socio-economic context also aggravates their disenchantment and the fact that they're attracted to these groups. Al-Qaeda somehow is a sort of very anti-system organization. It can be perceived this way. In the case of Iraq, the fact is that the reconciliation was never part of the US plans, and Maliki has never really been truthful to its promise to embody this reconciliation. It was part of his priorities in 2006. He actually made his campaign around this project of reconciliation, and it's never taken place.
Hadil Al-Sayegh, do you agree that the radicalization in Iraq has been this long-term phenomenon, what Miriam Benrad was just saying, and it's taken a long time and it's grown roots?
I think to say that it's happened for a long time, I would say maybe over the last decade, and that is something as a result of certain policies that were made in Iraq by in consultation with the Shia leadership, which is the anti-Ba'athi policy. Unfortunately, now this policy is now used to arrest any individual without due cause or whatnot. The future is grim unless there is some sort of national reconciliation. Having said that, the amount of attacks that Iraq has experienced, more than 6,000 people have died in any country, you'd be declaring some sort of force majeure. To see that we are still not in a full-scale sectarian war is something to be, that is something very quite commendable. And I think people are quite tired. They experience the worst, the darkest days from 2005 to 2008, and they don't want to go back. However, national reconciliation is the biggest priority that Iraq needs to pursue to move forward. All
right, let's hope that the peace will come. Hadil Al-Sayeg, I want to thank you for joining us. I want to thank Kirk Soul as well for being with us from Amman, Alex Crowther in Washington, Miriam Benrad, and William Jordan. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.